Okay, thank you for that very generous introduction. Um, let's hope indeed that the slides will work. Well, they work for me here, and they work online. And I think you don't need them until I'll be showing you some results a bit later on. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to be talking about historical approaches to standardization and prescriptivism in Dutch. That's what I'm working on mostly. I'll talk a little bit about some models of standardization as a historical process, some blind spots, and I'll talk a little bit about historical sociolinguistic approaches to this topic. Then I'll tell you a little bit about standardization history of Dutch, of Southern Dutch varieties particularly, and I'll show you some results from 3 research projects that we had running in Brussels on pluricentricity, on the influence of French, and on norms and usage. And I'll see if I have time for some concluding thoughts. What I'm presenting is work on research projects that I've done with different colleagues. We have a really great team in Brussels with a lot of young people doing excellent work on these topics, and I'll be drawing on work from the research projects. You don't see it here, but by Iris van der Voorde, Charlotte Verheijden, and Eline Lismont. They've all been involved as PhD researchers in the projects that I'll be talking about, and a lot of the work that I've been doing, 2 of the 3 projects that I'll talk about, are joint projects between Brussels and Leiden in collaboration with Gijsbert Rutten, somebody that I work a lot with on this topic. So that being said, let's move on. And my point of departure for the talk today is standardization as a historical process. And then a logical point of departure is the seminal paper of Einar Haugen, Dialect, Language and Nation, which he published in 1966, a very well-known work on standardization. I think still a dominant model of standardization as a historical process today. And in this paper from 1966, he introduces 4 concepts that are needed to describe the historical process of standardization, or as Haugen puts it himself, the 4 aspects of language development to take the step from dialect to language, from vernacular to standard. And notice the very practical, sort of very applied language planning and policy perspective here from vernacular to standard. Haugen, in fact, aimed to build on the earlier work of Ferguson in the early 1960s into the path that underdeveloped languages must take to become adequate instruments for a modern nation. That was sort of the background of the approach here. And Haugen offers 4 essential dimensions of standardization that you might be familiar with. Most essential to Haugen are codification of form and the elaboration of function. Codification consists in, quoting Haugen here, developing forms of a language, so its linguistic structure, including phonology, grammar, and lexicon, in line with what Ferguson in 1962 actually had more generally equated with standardization as a whole. And on the functional side, Haugen also talks about elaboration, focusing mainly on the use of a written standard in more prestige domains, such as scientific discourse or technical domains. And so elaboration contributes to the idea that the standard language has maximal variation in function. And so if you take this form and this function dimension together, you can arrive at the Haugen sort of basic definition that I still think is quite valuable today of a standard variety as being a variety that possesses minimal variation in form and maximal variation in function. Still adding to the form dimension, however, is also the step of selection of a norm. So the selection of a basis from which standard language norms can be derived. And Haugen presents this as a relatively top-down process. We'll come back to that later. In his initial work in 1966, he mostly focuses on what now we would call macro selection, so the selection of a variety, a regional, a social variety that will serve as the basis from which standard language norms can then be derived. But he also hints at what we would now call micro-selection, so the selection process not at the level of the variety, but at the level of variance for specific variables, because that doesn't always coincide, of course. And then there's the fourth dimension that he refers to, that's again related to function, and that's acceptance by the community. And this is a very crucial, important step, of course. This is what Duimert and Van den Busse have called the Achilles heel of the standardization process, because that's where it often goes wrong. A few years later, Haugen replaced the terminology acceptance by propagation, in order to have a more active stance as for the other three dimensions. And then in his later work on this in the 1980s, in 87, I believe, he changes it to implementation, which he defines as, quoting here, the activity of a writer, an institution, or a government in adopting and attempting to spread the language form that has been selected and codified, end quote. I think certainly as well known as Haugen's 1966 seminal paper is the 1985 book by Leslie and James Milroy, that I think many of you will be familiar with as well, which for standardization as a historical process, I think makes two main contributions. The first is to stress this idea of intolerance of optional variability in language as a crucial aspect of standardization. So referring to this minimal variation in form dimension of Haugen. And the second major contribution of the Milroys here lies in their description of standardization as an ideology. And we'll come back to that later as well. Of course, many other people expanded on the original model of Haugen, have also criticized and have corrected this model of Haugen in many ways. We did a special issue in 2020, we being Gijsbert Rutte, John Joseph, and myself, a special issue in language policy where we discuss a lot of the the major criticisms of this standardization model. Well, we discussed the relevance, but also the limitations of the model, and we identify a few main points of criticism. The first being the role of ideology, or the complete absence of ideology in Haugen's work, which I think is very obvious, but maybe not that surprising if you situate it in time, of course. Haugen's work also has a very strong monolingual bias. I won't go into that today, but looks at the steps from a non-standardized variety to a standard language, as if languages exist in pure isolation of other languages. And the model, although I think this is maybe exaggerating a little bit, or maybe putting a bit too much criticism in Haugen's, pushing it in Haugen's shoes, is that the model tends to be interpreted in a rather linear way, with a first step, a second step, sequential order, whereas other people like Wendy Ayres-Bennett, for instance, also has pointed this out, have described these four dimensions as more cyclical, as more overlapping, not so linear. It also links up with a criticism that the model of Haugen is rather teleological. He departs from modern-day standard languages and then back projects in time, the inevitable evolution towards a standard language. In fact, we have a project that's just starting in Brussels now, that's looking at failed attempts of standardization at different points in time to counterbalance this teleological bias, of course, only back projecting from what ended up making it into the standards. And then the main point of criticism is the question of directionality of standardization. I skipped over it in the previous slide, which you can see anyway, but John Joseph in his 87 work introduced the distinction between language standards and standard languages, aligned with what he calls circumstantial standardization versus engineered standardization. Circumstantial and standardization refers to sort of more bottom-up tendencies of conventionalization and the spread of usage standards, which often arise through dialect contact and the related leveling processes, whereas engineered standardization is much more of a top-down conscious process. And it aligns also with, I think, with terminology of standardization from above and from below, which is, well, although there's still some terminological things to clear up, I think, but in a recent handbook of language standardization edited by Wendy Ayres-Bennett and John Bellamy, Gijsbert Rutten and I wrote the chapter on standardization from above, and Stefan Elspas wrote a chapter on standardization from below. And I think it aligns with this terminology of Joseph to some extent. So standardization from above occurring when language authorities seek to consciously disseminate a standard variety across a speech or writing community. And from below, of course, can refer to this sort of conventionalization, emergence of usage standards, but also, and that's also the take that Elspas very much takes in his chapter, refers to the question of whose usage are we looking at, taking a perspective from below by looking at sources produced by less literate people, by, let's say, the bulk of the population, of course, in historical settings, less formal genres, which is also important and which raises a lot of questions about implementation and the success of standardization more generally. My perspective today is a perspective from historical sociolinguistics, where standardization is, again, after being out of vogue for quite a while, is sort of, again, an important topic, a well-researched topic the last couple of years. And maybe I can say a few words about historical sociolinguistics, my perspective here, before delving into it more, because I'm assuming you're all familiar with sociolinguistics proper, but historical sociolinguistics, well, I think for me is first and foremost a kind of sociolinguistics, a branch of sociolinguistics that explores the social dimensions of language in historical contexts and settings. So just like contemporary sociolinguists, historical sociolinguists seek to understand how linguistic practices reflect and shape social identities, social relationships, and structures. But we try to extend these insights into the past. And to be able to do that, we rely on the uniformitarian principle, which is, I guess you could say, a working hypothesis from the geological sciences, which proposes that the forces that are governing variation and change nowadays are similar or the same as the forces governing variation and change in the past. So the same sort of very basic mechanisms that we can use to understand how language works today can be understood to work in a similar way in the past. Think of things like the role of social networks or interspeaker accommodation processes as a motor for change and these kinds of things. Of course, it doesn't apply to very concrete concepts such as gender or social class. Obviously, you can't apply those anachronistically across time. This is the historical paradox as formulated by Lebov, the idea that we know that the past was different, we just don't know exactly how different it was. And that's where the sort of empirical challenge lies, of course, to take up this challenge of finding out just how different past language use in a social context really was. And at the same time, historical sociolinguistics can also be thought of as a new approach within historical linguistics, or maybe even as an alternative to more traditional approaches within historical linguistics and language history. This is certainly true if we think about the data that historical sociolinguists usually work with. Instead of using predominantly printed sources produced by social elites, historical sociolinguists tend to foreground the importance of looking at different kinds of text types and different groups of language users. And in doing so, of course, we run into what's often been called the bad data problem. The historical record, of course, is limited, it's fragmentary, and it's biased in many different ways. Primarily representing, of course, the sort of more formal written language or printed language, I should say, sort of heavily edited printed language of social elite, mostly men, of course, higher status, educated men. And rather than doing away with this completely, we mostly focus on trying to supplement this and to try to broaden, to expand the empirical basis for historiographical work. So trying to focus also on less formal genres, such as ego documents, personal correspondence, handwritten rather than printed and edited texts, and also bringing into focus the language produced by more ordinary men and women of diverging social, educational, and also regional backgrounds. So the kind of language use that's often overlooked in more traditional histories of the language. Of course, in doing so, trying to reconstruct a sort of a more fine-grained picture of how language has been used across different layers of past societies. And for the histories of Dutch, this is what inspired us to start paying attention to southern varieties of Dutch for the early and late modern period. So the Dutch-speaking, we're talking about southern varieties of Dutch. I'm referring to the Dutch-speaking areas of Belgium nowadays, or Flanders. And these southern varieties of the Dutch language get a lot of attention for the Middle Dutch period. But this change is going into the early modern period when Holland becomes the central region of the Low Countries. Don't want to give too extensive a history lesson here, but with the 80 Years' War, the Low Countries get split up, with the northern provinces proclaiming their independence, successfully proclaiming their independence as the Republic of the United Provinces, and entering in the 17th century what used to be called the Golden Age of the Low Countries, with a period of economic and cultural bloom, while the South is brought back under Catholic Spanish rule, under the Spanish crown, Philip II. And sort of, especially this is highlighted a lot in traditional narratives of the history, enters 2 centuries of foreign rule, first back under the Spanish crown, then moving to the Austrian side of the Habsburg dynasty, and at the end of the 18th century under French rule. Before the reunification of the Low Countries in 1815 and the Belgian independence in 1830. Yeah, it's hard to keep concentrated. After the southern Low Countries are conquered again by Spain, a lot of intellectuals leave the southern Low Countries. They move to the Protestant north. And at that time, the standardization process starts to really take off in the northern province of Holland, which also linguistically enters a sort of a golden age, or that's at least a traditional narrative, with the form and the functions of modern Dutch really taking shape there and then. And at the same time, the South started to enter a period of economic, of cultural decline, and it's often assumed also linguistic decline. And the image of southern varieties of Dutch in the early and late modern period is not good at all. And that's quite an understatement. Now it's a pity that you can't see the quotes that I have on the slide, because I have a couple of quotations on the slide talking about southern varieties of Dutch before the 1815 reunification of the Low Countries. They talk about the language in the South regressing to its purely provincial character, shriveling and impoverishing, standardization stagnating in the 17th and the 18th century, Dutch in the South losing prestige, losing functions, and being cut off from the standardization process in the northern Netherlands. And this is what Gijsbert Rutten and I in previous work have labeled the myth of southern language decay. And so it basically boils down to the idea that Southern Dutch in the 17th and the 18th and the early 19th century was, first of all, uncodified and linguistically not innovative, with the northern province of Holland acting as the sort of the center from which language norms emerge and spreading first to the rest of the northern Low Countries and then spreading sort of slowly trickling down to the south. So it's related to the status of Dutch as a pluricentric language today. The second aspect of this that I will be talking about is the idea that it's overshadowed by French. French had taken on the role of a prestige variety in the southern Low Countries, and thus is the assumption blocking the need for the development of an Androcentric standard, but also leading to southern varieties of Dutch with a lot of influence from French. And then the third aspect of it is that it's cut off from this ongoing standardization process in the north, and sort of a halted or a retarded standardization in the south. And this, of course, builds on sort of the assumption that standardization is very much a top-down process. The idea is, that with different foreign entities in charge, French becomes the language of culture, language of the social elite, and that sort of that takes away the impetus for standardization of Dutch, and sort of makes the language regress to its local character, leads to language decay, is what you see in traditional histories of the language. And of course, you can tell from all of the hedging in my sentences that I think this image is not correct, of course, and needs to be reevaluated in light of corpus linguistic evidence. And I'll try to go over some work on each of these aspects, on pluricentric diffusion, on the influence of French, and on sort of the relationship between norms and usage, perspective on sort of language, standard language perspective more broadly. Let's go to the first issue, norm diffusion, and the diffusion of linguistic changes in a language area which has been described as pluricentric. Haugen's model, I think, sort of implicitly departs from a monocentric ideal, the idea of one variety serving as the basis for the standard. Although in his later work he also allows for the possibility of a compositional form of standard languages, or what Doimert and Van der Bussen call polycentric standardization. But the idea is at least that there is one or there are multiple centers from which norms spread. And so pluricentricity for us here is a model where there are more geographical areas that set the norm, which then diffuses over the larger speech community. Whether you agree that you want to call that pluricentricity or not is a matter that we can discuss. Klein's classic definition of pluricentricity depends on multiple normative centers, but also has a very strong national component in there and national varieties. And this is, of course, very difficult if we project it into the past and a pre-sort of nation-state context. But I think it also shows that this is why pluricentricity is a context that needs to be historicized and needs to be tested historically. That's what the project that I'm referring to set out to do to a significant extent. And if we look at sort of the traditional histories of Dutch, the perspective is one of a shifting camera, or a conceptualization of pluricentricity, which we have in fact termed consecutive monocentrism. It's the idea that in the medieval period, there's a lot of the normative center is understood to lie in Flanders, then sort of the center shifts to Brabant in the 16th century, and then with the 80 Years' War, it shifts to the north in Holland. So you get one center, but it sort of shifts over time. Holland remains dominant well into the 19th century, although then at the same time, Brabant develops as a sort of a secondary center in the south, as opposed to more peripheral Flanders. And so the idea is that the southern Low Countries, to any extent, sort of depend in a, let's say, in a distance relationship on norm diffusion from the north and from the linguistic center in Holland. And this is what we wanted to test empirically and to weigh against also competing pluriareal models, which have been developed mostly for German. And Iris, who did her PhD on this, looked at 6 different variables, spelling, phonology, in different levels of the language. And I'll focus on 2 of those as an example here. To do this, we compiled a corpus. You would see now a nice map and with the build-up of the corpus and a link to consult the corpus if you're interested. But we compiled a corpus of just under 500,000 words, compiled in Brussels and in Leiden, and it's now hosted by the Institute for the Dutch Language. It's available for anyone who's interested. We used a citizen science approach to digitize the material. And the corpus covers 4 time periods. For those of watching online, got cut off from the slide somehow, but there's material from the middle of the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th century. There's material from 4 different regions. So from Holland and Brabant as sort of the central regions in the north and the south respectively, and from Zeeland and Flanders or Vlaanderen as the more peripheral regions, also in the north and the south respectively. And it's also a multi-genre corpus, that is to say there are 3 genres in there right now. There are printed news pamphlets for all of those periods. There are handwritten ego documents, mostly journals, diaries, travelogues, handwritten, and there's handwritten administrative texts. We're expanding it. There's a 4th component being developed now, and it's going to be expanded over time. So as I said, I will look at 2 cases. So I don't have the examples to show you on the slides, but they're relatively simple features. The first one is a purely orthographical feature. It's the spelling of a long A sound in closed syllables, where the traditional practice was to indicate a long vowel with an E added to the original vowel. So a long A would be spelled as AE, whereas that's being replaced by the modern standard, which is doubling the original vowel, so a double A spelling. This is this is purely a spelling feature, almost purely a spelling feature. There are not a lot of phonological implications here. And the second feature that I won't show you, but I'll tell you about the results we have is from the relativizers, the shift from D to W forms in the relativization system. We're focusing on a subset here of daar and waar, with an optional preposition, so forms such as waarmee, with which, that are replacing older forms such as daarmee, so a change in the relativization system. So now what came out of these results? Can I turn this around? Is it possible to show this as a little screen? You can see a little bit. It's hard to think about what to say when you know that there's an audience online who see the slides and there's people here who don't see the slides. That's what really makes it hard to cater to 2 different audiences. But so what came out of this? Well, very basically, I won't go into the details and you can't see it here, but for some features such as the spelling of the long A that you see on the left side here, you get a pattern which is almost entirely what you would expect. You see very nice S-curves, you see a feature in flux, changing spelling norm here, but with very clear regional differences. You can see how the form sort of first took off in Holland, then sort of the incoming form diffused to Zeeland, which followed a bit later, but followed Holland quite quickly, and then sort of trickled down to the south, with Brabant leading the change there, and then slowly sort of reaching the more peripheral region of Vlaanderen or Flanders. So this is a pattern that fits very well with this Haugen model, and that could be seen as a very clear example of a pluricentric development in historical context. But then when we look at the relativizers here on the other side of the screen, well, we get a very different picture. We can see that Brabant is actually in the lead. The numbers are the highest for Brabant for the 16th century, but then it stagnates or it stays the same with a final boost in the 19th century. And then you can see a very similar pattern for the other 3 regions. So I won't go into the details here, but there is clearly no sort of sharp north-south divide here, and you don't see this typical pattern of norm diffusion from the center to the periphery. And this is, of course, the kind of pattern that we found for most of the variables that we looked at, or similar diverging patterns. So we don't observe this sort of typical pluricentric model that we would expect. And we think this is sort of, gives us the idea that the pluricentricity model doesn't have a lot of historical validity. It's quite simplistic model to account for, well, what basically are very sort of diverse regional dynamics that characterize the historical development of Dutch. Or any language for that matter, I think. And so reducing this to a story of norms spreading from a geographically dominant area to the rest of the language area is overly reductionistic. I don't want to say that this model of pluricentricity is not useful when we're talking about perceptions or attitudes. Think about the attitudinal status of national borders, for instance, where people talk about what people talk about a lot here. But if we historicize it in terms of language variation and change, in terms of centers from which norms of usage emerge, then it's too simplistic a model to account for sort of these diverse regional dynamics. Let's then turn to language context and the influence of French on southern varieties of Dutch. And I won't spend too much time here either, but we get older claims here of also very heavy borrowing from French. A lot of these claims actually date back to an 18th century complaint tradition that sort of traces back from the modern day to the 18th century. But of course also this needs to be nuanced based on empirical work, and most notably for Southern Dutch, the PhD project of Charlotte Vrije that I'll be drawing on here. Although it's worth mentioning that the team in Leiden had a large-scale project on language choice and Dutch-French language contact with a focus on the northern Netherlands as well. So we had a nice complementary perspective there. And Charlotte looked at French loan suffixes, lexical borrowings from French, and it should have said lexicogrammatical pattern. So all borrowings or impositions from French on Dutch. And she looked at this in three different corpora. The historical corpus of Dutch for a broad overview, the corpus that I referred to already. Then she also looked at a collection of soldiers' letters from the Napoleonic period. So letters written by quite ordinary, I was going to say men and women, but mostly, no, not mostly, exclusively men were drafted into Napoleonic armies from different battlefields all over Europe, as well as a self-compiled corpus of soldiers' letters from the First World War period. And without going into too much detail here, her research sort of calls for, I think we can say, sort of a historical deconstruction of this idea of Frenchification, which is a very dominant idea in the historiography of Dutch, which is very much based on nationalist discourses of French oppression. And what we see in the material is not a kind of monolithic, unidimensional process of French influence, but rather very fine-grained patterns of variation and change across genres, across regions, and across centuries. And we have some results here from the loan suffixes in this historical corpus of Dutch, where you can see that indeed one of the two regions in the south uses a relatively high amount of French loan suffixes, but it's not sort of a southern thing at all, because the other region in the south actually uses less even than the two regions in the north. So rather than sort of this idea of this is something of southern Dutch, there are more sort of fine-grained patterns, where here we have one example on a regional basis. And even when this influence of French is there, it's quite limited to particular text genres. I don't have that on the slide, but it's, for instance, strongest in a lot of administrative writings. But when we look at ego documents, it's quite a different picture. When we look at more informal correspondence, for instance, so you get a kind of a misrepresentation in language histories based on a bias of the sources that we're looking at. Here, I need to make a correction in the slide, but you won't be able to see it anyway. I mislabeled. That's what you get when you have to send in the slides by midnight the night before the conference. These are not the data for loan suffixes, but for lexical borrowings. Lexical borrowings in this corpus of soldiers' correspondence from the First World War, where you can see that there is quite a lot of difference in terms of how much is being borrowed individually. You see some scribes contributing 16 French loans per 1,000 words to, I think the maximum is 44 per 1,000 words. But a lot of variation also per letter, per individual, depending on the addressee, but also depending on the semantic domains present in the letters. There are some cases of writers who never use any French loans in one particular letter, but then another letter, when they're talking about, for instance, military affairs, it's very, very highly present. So I think overall, we have good reasons to not overestimate the influence of French based on historical discourses about language contact. And there's this need to nuance this idea that Southern Dutch was completely sort of dominated by French. And when this influence of French is there, it's limited to particular text genres, and there's a lot of individual variation that we need to take into account. And so then we come to our final case study that I want to discuss, which leads us to sort of a reflection on the impact of codified norms on language use. And here it's, I think, important to realize that most traditional histories of Dutch often based claims of this halted standardization process in the South on a limited number of metalinguistic publications. There are many grammars and other normative works being published for the northern Netherlands. There's a very solid metalinguistic tradition, especially from the 17th century onwards. And there's an assumed lack thereof in the South. And that lack of a sort of a superimposed codified standard is then taken as an explanation for this sort of presupposed regression to local dialectal forms. And there are a number of problems with this. First and foremost, empirically, while northern codifiers did receive a lot of historiographical attention, this doesn't mean that there was no normative tradition in the South at all. In fact, as Gijsbert and I have argued extensively elsewhere, there was quite a lively normative tradition in the South, especially from the 18th century onwards, very often with a strong didactical focus. But it's simply, a lot of these grammars, a lot of these metalinguistic works had just never been looked at. It just never been studied. A lot of them had even been deemed lost, in fact. And many grammars were very much aware of metalinguistic debates in the northern Netherlands, and they showed a relatively high sensitivity to geographical variation in Dutch, but they also innovated, and they had quite lively debate among themselves. And that lively debate, of course, indicates that there's sort of a lively normative tradition. But second of all, beyond this empirical question, we can also wonder about to which extent formalized linguistic norms are important in influencing language use and shaping actual language use, of course. This is what Eline Lismond set out to investigate in a project where she defended her PhD on. She defended it just a couple of weeks ago. While a lot of older works sort of discuss what happens in grammars, in school books, in linguistic treatises, as a proxy of what's happening in the language in a broader sense, of course, we know that this builds on a very dangerous presupposition that prescribed language norms dictate usage. And together with Gijsbert again, I've argued a number of times that the impact of norms on language is first and foremost ideological, also historical. It's at the level of meta-language, of course. And the level of actual language used, that remains to be explored and is in any case secondary. And this is where we link up with the work of the Milroys that we referred to before about the importance of ideology also in historical context, especially in the late modern period. There's a very strong rise of standard language ideology in the Low Countries, and you get this schematization of social linguistic space. Especially when we look at sources from below, we get a language situation in the 18th century that has been characterized as diaglossic. But language planning as part of, let's say, the nation-building enterprise of the 18th century then tries to, and then quite successfully, erases this diaglossic variation discursively and tries to reorient social linguistic space, thank you, into standard versus non-standard, or into inside of our part of our language and not part of our language. So sort of projecting a desire for homogeneity, a desire for uniformity at the level of the nation onto the level of the onto the language itself. When we're turning to, of course, this is sort of this growing ideology of correctness and normativity and uniformity can impact language use. And this is, it's an empirical matter, of course, and there's been quite some debate in historical social linguistics about this, but there's also been quite a solid research tradition focusing on attempts of codifiers to spread norms of correctness and to influence usage. There's been a lot of work for English, but also for French, for German, for Dutch, and for other languages. We had a volume with Benjamin's a couple of years back on norms and usage from the 16th to the 19th century for some of these languages. But the scopes and the approaches, they do differ a lot. You know, you get some studies focusing on one particular grammarian's influence and looking at different features. You get some studies focusing on one particular linguistic feature and study it across different grammar books and then try to match it up with what's happening in usage. And not surprisingly, the results from a lot of these studies vary quite a lot as well. There are some studies which find some influence, although some of it is indirect. It's often relatively limited, but there's also studies which don't find any influence of prescribed language norms at all, and they describe norm givers capturing rather than shaping linguistic practices. And what we think is needed is sort of more systematic work trying to look into determinants of prescriptive success, also as a basis for more comparative work later. And this is what I've done with a number of colleagues in several publications, trying to sort of look at possible factors to determine prescriptive success. Starting out, of course, from the chronology of changes, and that's fundamental, sort of trying to very carefully map out what's happening when, both in norms and in usage, and trying to take, of course, into account that there can be a certain prescriptive time lag. Something is prescribed, but it takes a while before it can sort of reasonably be expected to be picked up in usage. And of course, only when changes in norms predate changes in usage, we can assume there to be a normative effect, at least in the actuation stage of the change. And if prescriptive injunctions follow ongoing developments in usage, well, the possible impact is more limited. It can just be sort of an additional effect of speeding up or slowing down already ongoing changes. We discussed some other factors as well, such as the nature of the variable, the envelope of variation, the degree of metalinguistic salience as possible determinants, but maybe I'll skip those for reasons of time. I have 1 minute, but I think I'm going to need 2 or 3 more. I'll eat into the discussion time a little bit. Was thrown off a little bit, but we had a project looking at precisely this, at these determinants, and trying to look at different variables of spelling, morphology, morphosyntactic features with this, and trying to map out how they appear in a precept corpus of prescriptions, of grammars, of school books, and so on. A precept corpus of 74 normative works. from the northern and the southern Netherlands, and then trying to map that onto what's happening in a corpus of usage, this usage corpus that I've referred to before. So I won't spend too much time looking at the results here. Maybe I can save some time there because you don't see the results anyway, and it's pointless if you can't see it. If you have the slides, you can have a look at it later. But focusing just on one feature here, the same spelling feature that we looked at earlier, we can sort of, let's say, very generally see that changes in the norms, you sort of, for the norms, you see quite a capricious pattern. You see sort of a clear orientation towards these modern double A spellings in northern grammars and spelling guides, whereas for the south, you see sort of more diverging norms. You see often a double orientation. Whereas if you compare that to what's happening in usage, you get a much more sort of regular S-curve pattern for a gradual change, where the north does lead the way. You sort of see the shift towards these modern AA spellings from the 17th century onwards and completed by the 19th century. And then you see for the south that it comes a bit later. It's actually only really the beginning of the 19th century when the switch happens. And so okay, change here at the normative level sort of precedes what's happening in usage. But if you look more closely, the patterns don't really match up. The prescriptions are quite disparate. It's quite a capricious pattern, as I said, and grammarians and spelling authorities don't really agree. Whereas you get a much more predictable S-curve pattern in usage. So it seems relatively unlikely that there is any influence from prescription on norms. There is a time lag, but the time lag here is quite large because you see these first AA prescriptions already dating back to the 16th century, whereas the actual change in usage, really starts to happen 2 centuries later. So, you would expect some kind of prescriptive time lag, but not 2 centuries probably. So you can see that I think prescriptive efforts, to conclude here, are sort of not successful for a lot of these case studies. They're sometimes successful, but they're never successful in a very straightforward way. In many cases, rather than initiating changes or introducing new forms, what grammarians do is they capture changes that are on the way. They observe what is moving in the language, and then at a certain point, they decide to jump on the bandwagon, or they try to halt it. So they sort of essentially, they're limited to either speeding the diffusion process up or sort of slowing down the spread of undesired changes. And this is more likely in cases of spelling and for sociolinguistically salient features. And it's particularly there in the context of the 18th and the 19th century, sort of when you have this kind of nationalization of grammar, that these efforts have most effects, and that standardization at the time when, let's say, standardization becomes accompanied by this standard language ideology. And in fact, Eline in her PhD discusses several scenarios of possible prescriptive influence, which are meant to help us test and evaluate possible impact of prescribed language norms on language use. But I think historically we can conclude that standardization is first and foremost a language ideological, a discursive process that aims at rearranging sociolinguistic space. And its impact on language use itself is relatively restricted, is in any case gradual, and is only likely in a number of sort of well-described scenarios. I think that's the main message here. I don't think I have a lot of time for a lot of concluding thoughts, but I think maybe to wrap it up, I can say that standardization as a historical process, looking back on this model of Haugen, is still quite valuable, but there are a number of important blind spots in there. Most importantly, the insight that standardization cannot be framed as purely a top-down process. And in any sense, they've been sort of applied in an overly simplistic way to language historical case studies. I think maybe I'll leave it at that. We can discuss it further if you have any questions during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is my mic, is it working? Yeah, thank you very much. And super sorry for the slides. We didn't see it coming.
At least a reasonable solution.
Do we have a question from the audience? Many questions.
Thank you. It was really cool. But all the time I actually struggled with the idea that what is actually nowadays. I don't know how pluricentric is nowadays Dutch language. Like to have different norms for Belgian Dutch and for Dutch Dutch.
Yeah, Dutch is now described as pluricentric in the sense of norms of usage, let's say. You can sort of see different regional normative centers nowadays in the north and the south. And there is also at an attitudinal level not a very strong orientation anymore to the other part of the language area, to the other of the two main countries where Dutch is spoken. So in that sense, it's usually described as pluricentric. At the sort of official level, norms are, to the extent that they are officialized, they're officialized by the Dutch Language Union, which is a transnational treaty organization, in fact, between the Netherlands, Belgium, and also Suriname. But they're not very prescriptive, or we, because I'm also part of it, I should say, I'm still not used to saying we for that, not very prescriptive. There is a prescribed spelling norm, that is a shared spelling norm, but there are no prescribed norms apart from that. So in that sense, maybe it's less pluricentric, but I think what's most important is sort of in an attitudinal sense, yes, certainly pluricentric. And I haven't talked about Suriname then at all yet, because that's quite a different and even more complicated addition to the story. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. I have two questions which I was wondering about related to kind of different time periods. But well, I'll ask first earlier. So in English studies of standardization and with sociolinguistic approaches, since the early data is very messy, that from like late Middle English to early modern, I think there's been studies which use things like social network analysis and communities of practice and things like that, and found out that like there's Paston letters and they're from Norfolk, and when they are writing back home, they use sort of Norfolk dialectal forms, and then when they are addressing some people in London, they use something which is incipient standardization, but not very much codified. Have you thought of doing something like that for the period when northern parts are independent and standardizing, and then the southern parts, they presumably have contacts to the north? And
yeah, there are quite intensive contacts with the North and between the North and the South at this period of the 80 Years' War, of course, because there's a lot of immigration northwards, but also back and forth, of course, with different regime changes, and a lot of intellectuals, of course, were quite open to the Reformation, and then with the recapture of Spanish, there's a lot of people moving to the north, but also moving to Germany, to the north of Germany, and then moving onwards and so on. And so there's quite a lot of contact, there's quite a lot of going back and forth. And actually, yes, we have, that's the I thought I'd have time for 4 case studies, but I didn't even have time for 3 case studies. But the 4th one that I dropped is a more recent project that we have that's focusing on this period around the end of the 16th century, around the fall of Antwerp. We're looking at correspondence, mostly merchants' correspondence, from the city of Antwerp, which is a cultural hub, of course, at the time. And after it's captured in 1585 by the Spanish, there's a lot of migration outside of the city going northwards. So there we're trying to take this kind of more approach of looking at intra-speaker variation, trying to sort of have a more microscopic view of what's going on there, as opposed to this sort of rather macroscopic view that I've presented here today. Yeah, so maybe at another conference I can talk about that, but that's yeah, certainly something that's quite interesting.
Thanks very much. The second thing I was wondering, that when you start getting normative works, how do they position themselves with respect to sort of northern normative works, northern prescriptivism, and so.
Well, that's quite interesting. The sort of the orientation to how broad is the orientation? I assume you mean in geographical terms, because in social terms this is extremely narrow. Of course, you know, this highly elitist grammars, and the idea is not, of course, to reach a broad population, but to mostly, you know, reach other people from the same elitist circles, let's say. But in geographical terms, the very earliest works, they have a very broad scope. In fact, the orientation of the language area very often includes Low German as well. There's this idea that there's a continuum of Dutch, Low German, Duits. Terminology also varies, of course, from let's say from the north of France, which was still Dutch-speaking at the time, almost to the Baltics. That's the idea. Very early on, but throughout this, over the 17th century in the north, that sort of narrows down. You sort of see the idea of the geographical focus narrowing down a lot. So that's quite an interesting process to look at as well, how sort of the discursive construction of the language area changes as a result of this historical development as well.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
Thank you. You mentioned this attempt to break this myth about the decay of the Southern Dutch. How has this process been accepted by the public, or how it has been received by the public?
That's a good question. Thank you for that. We were talking about this the other night at dinner. It's difficult sometimes because this sort of idea of the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium being dominated by French for centuries, and sort of that having a severe impact on the language. And then sort of 1815, the reunification of the Low Countries sort of comes in as a saving moment, saving the future of that. That's sort of part of the nationalist narrative, the national Flemish narrative, still today. So there's a lot of interest from sort of those kinds of circles in this research, because, you know, tend to be quite interested in this kind of work, but it challenges, I mean, it doesn't sound controversial to an international audience, but it challenges a core aspect of the national narrative, of a separate sort of Flemish identity, sort of an underdog narrative. So it's quite controversial in that sense, and there's quite some opposition to it. That's sometimes fun, but sometimes also frustrating to deal with.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all. We cannot take any more questions.